Hello everyone, Basil here, and welcome to part 2 of the top 10 gore fests you've never heard of. In the last video, we discussed the first 5 conflicts that I chose, so if you haven't seen that video, I certainly recommend you do. Now, the wars discussed there, whilst obscure, were nothing particularly massive and impactful on world affairs. However, the ones you're about to see are both massive and never discussed. Seriously though, prepare to be outraged and scream, "How the actual fuck have I never heard of these?" Before we get in, I'd like to warn you that this video contains discussions of extreme violence and some rather graphic imagery that isn't exactly family friendly. Viewer discretion is advised. With that said, enjoy. Number 5. The Second Congo War. Ooh boy, where do I even begin with this one? This is by far the most confusing conflict on this list, as it involves close to a dozen African countries in the single deadliest war in the continent's history, fighting over a whole variety of confusing political issues. The history of the Congo is tragic, to say the least. After gaining independence from the Belgians in 1960, who committed their share of atrocities under King Leopold II, they established a democratic government under Joseph Kasavubu, which only lasted for about 5 years until General Mobutu Sese Seko took power in a coup and established a dictatorship. Mobutu was a strange dictator. On the one hand, he was supposed to be an American anti-communist ally, but styled his country after Maoist philosophy and governance. He renamed the country Zaire and nationalized all of its industries, which allowed him to plunder its resources and completely impoverish the place over his reign. Things would change, however, when the Rwandan genocide occurred, which was a systematic killing of Tutsis by the Hutus in neighboring Rwanda, which caused up to 900,000 deaths. This caused a considerable refugee crisis at the border, which destabilized several regions in the Congo as militias from both the Hutus and the Tutsis clashed with local rebels. The current government in Rwanda had stopped the genocide with leadership by Paul Kagame. Now he wished to take control of the situation at the border, but unfortunately, Mobutu was too old and decrepit to be of much help. With me still? Good, because this is where things get hard to follow. With the help from Uganda, who had its own problem with the Congolese militias at its border, they were able to sponsor a rebel leader named Laurent Kabila to overthrow Mobutu, beginning the First Congo War, which succeeds, and the old tyrant was forced to flee the country in 1997. However, Kabila was just as non-compliant and ineffective as Mobutu, and did little of that Rwandans and Ugandans had wished of him. Some of Kabila's forces mutinied against him in 1998, since they believed he was nothing but a foreign puppet, which he sort of was, albeit not a great one. The Allies jumped on this opportunity to back them, beginning the Second Congo War. Uganda and Rwanda were able to launch a daring attack which involved sending several plane loads of troops to the western side of the Congo to capture the capital, Kinshasa. At first, the operation went well, however, just as they were about to succeed, a strange web of international alliances began to kick in. It first began with Angola, which was a strong ally of Kabila, and they saw it as necessary to come to the man's aid. The attack on Kinshasa was thwarted by the intervening Angolan forces. Just to make things even more confusing, Chad, Burundi, Sudan, Zimbabwe, Namibia, Zambia, Tanzania, South Africa, Libya, the Central African Republic, and Israel all became involved for differing political reasons which simply isn't the scope of this video. This is not to mention the dozens of different factions and militias within each participating nation that had their own conflicting interests. The fighting devolved into a bloody stalemate with battles occurring all across the Congo. The style of fighting was particularly brutal, notorious for the massive use of child soldiers who were pumped up with drugs and sent indiscriminately to rape and pillage. Large numbers of civilians were displaced and killed in the chaos, and the tendencies of the rapacious soldiers, along with the breakdown of the already weak medical infrastructure, caused a massive spike of AIDS infections in the region. Several attempts were made at a peace settlement of some kind by African states and the United Nations, but little came of these. Fighting only died down when Laurent Kabila was assassinated by one of his own child soldiers and replaced with his son, Joseph Kabila, in 2001. Who decided that the fighting needed to stop. A peace was finally agreed upon in 2002, and all the countries involved slowly withdrew their forces. But that being said, occasional fighting still occurs between Rwanda and the Congo to this very day. Many observers have referred to this event as the World War Africa for its similarity to World War I and its complex politics. Estimates of the total amount of people killed in this conflict rarely agree, since this was a very chaotic war and records are scant. However, most of them come to around 4 million deaths. Over 80% of these were civilian due to the famines and epidemics that were a consequence of the fighting. Number 4. The MughalMaratha War. You know, Indian history is fairly peaceful compared to other places. No, seriously, compared to the average, the Indian subcontinent hasn't seemed to have had as many brutal upheavals in its past, especially when you consider that the region is massive and diverse, even although the aforementioned Bengali genocide might make you think otherwise. That being said, it's no stranger to some really big wars, which brings us to our next case. The Mughal Empire at its zenith in the 17th century was huge, dominating almost all of India. The Mughals were a Muslim tribe that had emerged from what is today southern Afghanistan, and were able to completely defeat the various kingdoms in the Indian subcontinent and establish a sprawling dominion by the end of the 16th century, at least in the north. The empire fell into chaos when the Mughal Empire, Shah Jahan, fell seriously ill. Sensing his approaching death, his sons began to scheme amongst one another to take the throne for themselves once he had passed away. This plunged the empire into civil war as Aurangzeb, the youngest of the brothers, was able to gain the upper hand and best his rivals. However, it turns out that his father, the real emperor, wasn't on death's doorstep and recovered. Not willing to give up on his newfound power, Aurangzeb had him imprisoned, completing his ascension to the throne and re-establishing order amongst the Mughals. Aurangzeb would prove to be a ruthless autocrat. He was a highly devout Muslim ascetic and prohibited almost anything he found impure, from banning art to alcohol and even music. He was extremely intolerant of Hinduism and set out to demolish hundreds of Hindu temples and replace them with mosques. He then set his sights on expanding the Mughal Empire southwards, which is where he would meet a powerful foe. Now, the Marathas were an assortment of Hindu clans who had united under a common banner in their opposition against the Mughals. They were led by the hero Shivaji, who organized numerous daring raids on Mughal possessions. He was able to carve out a substantial domain for the empire, which highly angered Aurangzeb, who sent his top generals to find Shivaji, but to no avail. There were also the fact that plenty of rebellions were popping up in the north, which meant that much of his attention was diverted. In 1680, however, Shivaji died of illness and was succeeded by his son, Shambhaji, who was a lot more aggressive and a lot less pragmatic, attacking the Mughals relentlessly with no caution. Aurangzeb had been gathering his armies during this time, and in 1683 decided to personally set out on an expedition to finally crush the Marathas once and for all. This meant also going to war with the rest of southern India, since bringing it under his control would make crushing his enemies far easier. Whilst the Mughals rapidly overran the southern kingdoms, the Marathas proved to be incredibly difficult to eradicate. They had migrated to the Deccan Mountains and relied on a strategy that was essentially to continuously surrender forts and strongholds to the Mughals and then recapture them when they couldn't be defended. It was essentially guerrilla warfare. The war dragged on and on and on, and Aurangzeb became increasingly frustrated. Even after the capture of the Maratha leader, Shambhaji, in 1689, they still just wouldn't go away. Aurangzeb spent the rest of his life trying to kill Marathas until his death in 1707. The Marathas would never quite be defeated, as by this point, the Mughal Empire was beginning to fall apart from internal division and strife. It also didn't help that a certain British East India Company had been poking the regime for a while now and exploiting internal divisions in order to increase their influence. An estimated 4.5 million people lost their lives in this war, which was mostly due to famines. More soldiers died from starvation than actual combat, since Maratha fighters proved very good at disrupting vital supply lines of food. The event itself is quite controversial in India today, as many Hindus have seen Aurangzeb as a vicious thug who tried to bring the entire country under Islam, which is why there is considerable discrimination against Muslims in India. Number 3. The Russian Shmuta. People tend to view Russian history as this long nightmare of oppression, famines, and horrible tyrants. This is generally an oversimplification, but come to think of it, you can't help but feel like it's true. This seems especially apparent during the 17th century when the Shmuta, which roughly translates to time of troubles, was in full swing, and damn was it troubling. In 1533, a certain Ivan the Terrible ascended to the throne when he was just a toddler. For a while now, Russia was mostly ruled by the boyars, who schemed against each other for power whilst Ivan the Terrible had been a recluse, throwing small animals out of windows. However, he eventually matured, grew a pair of balls, and threw all the scheming aristocrats to hungry hunting dogs. Ivan was able to consolidate absolute power and go on a purge of thousands of political opponents, whether they be aristocrats or common folk. Many historians argue that this is where the Imperial Russian state truly began, as Ivan created many of the institutions that prevailed throughout Tsarist rule. However, whilst Ivan may have created the regime, it wasn't exactly a stable place without him. After his death in 1584 due to some rather suspicious circumstances, there was a bit of an issue of succession. Ivan had killed almost all of his children, mostly because of petty disagreements, which meant that the only person who could become Tsar was his son Fyodor. However, whilst he reigned for a peaceful 16 years, he was a bit mentally handicapped, for lack of a better term. Naturally, he had to have a regent, which in this case was his brother-in-law, Boris Godunov, who became the unofficial ruler of the country. However, when Fyodor died, succession proved difficult again since he produced no children. The only person who could become Tsar was Ivan's illegitimate son Dmitri, who was 9. Boris assumed power and had the young one exiled to a small town in Uglich, where he died after being cut. Now, Boris probably didn't kill him, but it still made a lot of people suspicious of his rule. This was also not helped by the massive famines that were devastating the country at the time, who some believed was a punishment from God for putting the false Tsar on the throne. So, when Dmitri mysteriously appeared alive and well on the outskirts of Russia, many decided that it was a good time to restore the true monarchy. Dmitri suddenly found himself in command of a massive ragtag army that marched straight towards Moscow, overthrew Boris, and put himself on the throne. Unfortunately, though, it turns out he was an impostor, and when he married a Polish princess, many Muscovites were highly disappointed, so they sent him up to attack the palace and drag Dmitri away, where he would be burnt alive, and succeeded by Vasily, who assumed power in the vacuum. But just as things seemed to be settling down, a second false Dmitri showed up, and was able to convince the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth to arrange an army and take him to Moscow. He was able to plow through Russia, but unable to reach the capital, so he decided to create a temporary dominion within the lands under his control. In a state of desperation, Vasily came to the Swedes to establish an alliance against this attack by Poland-Lithuania. However, the Poles saw this as a threat to their very existence, so they declared all-out war and invaded. The second false Dmitri was forced to withdraw, and the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth was able to reach and conquer Moscow, unseating Vasily, which plunged the country into anarchy. This was all while Cossack rebels were raiding the countryside and peasant uprisings were occurring all around the country. In other words, Russia was in a complete and utter clusterfudge. It was around this time when a third false Dmitri arrived, although he was dismissed by Poland and killed. This was because Poland fully intended to take control of all Russia and convert the population to Catholicism. To almost all Russians, this was unacceptable, so a volunteer army of militias was formed by several Russian noblemen to fight the invaders and restore order. At first, the volunteer army suffered from infighting, but they were eventually able to get it together and kick the Poles out in 1612. The following year, after more than a decade of chaos and disaster, Mikhail Romanov was made Tsar, and his dynasty would rule Russia with an iron fist until 1917. Most estimates place the total death toll for the time of troubles, including all the fatalities as a cause of the famines, at around 5 million, which was about half of the entire Russian population at the time, making this one of the most statistically lethal civil conflicts in human history. Number 2. The Conquests of Tamilan. The following isn't exactly a single conflict, more of a collection of wars, but I couldn't resist including the massive expansion of an empire of death whose leader would become responsible for more fatalities than several mass murderers who we know well. After the rise of the Mongol Empire, Central Asia was reduced to a complete wasteland. It used to be the seat of the Khwarezmid Empire, which was a massive center of knowledge, science, and civilization, and when it was conquered by Genghis Khan, by the way, it's actually Chinggis Khan, but I'll stick to the fake name, its people were completely exterminated, and everything of value was either destroyed or taken. Once the Mongol Empire divided, it remained mostly uninhabited for a few centuries, which is where we get the main character in this story. Tamerlane started his life in the country we now know as Uzbekistan, a country which I'm sure many of you know and love dearly. He began his career as a bandit, robbing anything from value, be that jewelry or livestock. But it wasn't exactly a safe job, as he would be wounded in his leg by an arrow from a disgruntled shepherd herder, rendering him limp for the rest of his life. However, he proved to be incredibly charismatic despite his disability, and he was able to gather a decently sized following of tribesmen to raid alongside him. It was at this time when large parts of Central Asia and the Middle East were in utter turmoil, and empires such as the Ilkhanate and Chagatai Khanate disintegrated, creating anarchy in the region. This created large numbers of malcontents in need of leadership, a role which Tamerlane was more than capable of filling. This allowed him to raise a small but skilled army of nomadic horsemen who were able to establish order in Transoxania, which is around Uzbekistan and Kyrgyzstan, and crowned himself emir in 1370. Once the Timurid Empire had been established, it was time for the upstart to flex his muscles and annex some territory for it, and boy did he prove to be good at annexing things. His first conquest was against the city of Herat in Persia, who he had first tried to establish an alliance with, but the ruler of the country kept on stalling and being annoying, so he decided to declare war in 1381. Tamerlane proved to be an absolute military genius and was able to defeat a roughly equal opponent within a few years. Of course, this would only be the first of many campaigns, and soon enough, he was launching military expeditions in all directions, expanding the empire to massive proportions. Up north, he was able to subdue the Golden Horde, which was a remnant of the Mongol Empire. Westwards, he conquered as far as Armenia and Iraq. Down south, he marched into India against the Sultan of Delhi, and razed everything he came across to the ground. The level of violence and brutality which Tamerlane employed in his conquests was and is to this day legendary. Whenever his army marched into a city, the entire civilian population was beheaded, with only people who he deemed useful to his conquests being spared. Afterwards, they would build massive pyramids of human skulls as a sort of victory pile. Entire ethnic groups were driven into extinction because of this. One of Timur's most infamous conquests was against the Turks, as he had a rivalry with Sultan Bayezid. He would end up wiping out the Turkish army and capturing him, keeping him as a captive on display in a birdcage to perpetually humiliate him until he died. His last conquest would be against China, however this would end in failure since he died of illness before he could reach their borders, bringing an end to his genocidal campaigns. One can say that Tamerlane was a sort of mini Genghis Khan, similar in many ways yet not as impactful. Still though, he killed more people than Hitler, about 17 million deaths in total, which was roughly 5% of the entire world's population at the time. His empire of death would end up disintegrating shortly after his reign ended. Okay people, this is it. The number one spot for the single biggest atrocity you've never heard of goes to, drumroll please, the Taiping Rebellion. Now, some of you history buffs listening are definitely not surprised at seeing this at the top of the list. I mean, seriously, how could I not include the war that killed more people than World War I whilst getting only an infinitesimal fraction of the coverage? China has had a history of massive upheavals that end up being unimaginably brutal, and this is no different, other than the fact that it was fought with modern weaponry and an absolutely insane cult ideology at its base. Let's start at the beginning. After the fall of the Ming dynasty in the 17th century, China fell under the rule of the foreign peoples known as the Manchus, who forged the Qing dynasty. At first, it was full of vitality and growth, allowing the country to recover to its former glory, but only for a brief moment. As time went by, bad leadership began to take hold, and by 1800, the kingdom started to fall down an endless spiral of corruption and ineffectiveness. By the mid-18th century, the Qing dynasty had devolved into an authoritarian clusterfuck that was extremely backward both socially and technologically, which meant that society was only one bright idea away from upheaval, which is where our story begins. Hong Xiuchuang was an aspiring academic in southern China who was studying hard to complete the civil service examinations. Now, the civil service tests were essentially an old Chinese tradition that would allow anyone who completed them to effectively be set for life, since they would get a cushy, well-paid job as an imperial bureaucrat, along with support for his entire extended family. Unfortunately, whilst Hong showed much promise, he ended up failing the examinations, and after trying it not only once, not twice, but 4 particularly frustrating times. Hong was under so much pressure that he suffered a nervous breakdown and fainted, where he is alleged to have had a vision of a bearded man handing him a sword and telling him to, quote, expel the demons from China. At first, Hong was confused, but one day he was walking through town when he met an Englishman. Now, China had recently been forced to let in a whole number of foreigners after the disastrous Opium War, and chief among them were the Christian missionaries. Because of this, Hong soon learned of the word of the Lord, which allowed him to fully rationalize what the vision had been all about. Hong had come to the logical conclusion that he was the younger brother of Jesus Christ and the Son of God, and was soon enough walking through China telling everyone of the wonderful news. At first, he was only able to gain a few random devotees, but after several years of preaching, he had accumulated a cult following of over 10,000 people, naming themselves the Society of the God Worshippers. The Qing authorities saw him as a threat, so decided to crack down hard on their activities in 1850. Seeing that as the time had come, the God Worshippers formed a paramilitary group and clashed with the soldiers. To everyone's shock, they were able to decisively defeat their enemy at the Battle of Jinqian. News of this spread far and wide, and because there was so much discontent with the current administration, they saw this as an opportunity to finally overthrow their alien oppressors. By 1853, Hong had amassed an army of around 2 million fighters and was able to capture an area of land about the size of Great Britain. Most importantly, though, he was able to take the city of Nanjing, which he renamed to Tianjin, or Heavenly Capital. The situation for the Qing dynasty would go from bad to critical when a fleet carrying around 100,000 troops was spotted marching up north straight towards the capital, Beijing. Desperate, the Qing officials gathered as much strength as they could to repel this attack. Fortunately for them, the rebels had run out of momentum and their attempts to take the city were thwarted. Still though, the war was far from won, as Hong had decided to consolidate in the areas he had captured. The Heavenly Kingdom, as it was called, was a strange society. Life was unimaginably puritanical, with the god worshippers outlawing anything from gambling to opium to sex, and even for married couples. In fact, men and women were completely segregated from one another, although they still gave women equal rights, allowing them to become fighters and hold high positions. They even outlawed foot-binding and female infanticide, sexist practices that were common throughout Chinese history. Despite this, it didn't stop Hong from hypocritically having a harem of over a dozen women. The Civil War devolved into a stalemate throughout the 1850s in a constant back and forth with neither side being able to achieve their aim and both resorting to extreme brutality whenever they captured a city. The rebels massacred all Manchus and officials, whilst burning any relics of Confucian or Buddhist ideology, which they deemed to be the demons that Hong was talking about. Meanwhile, the government used local warlords as mercenaries, who would indiscriminately butcher large numbers of civilians, since anyone could be a rebel. Hong made his final mistake when he attacked Shanghai, which was a major trading hub for the British. With their financial interests under threat, the Brits decided that enough was enough, and soon sent in a force of troops armed with modern weaponry to crush this problematic uprising. The foreign intervention, as well as the exhaustion on the part of the rebels, is what finally made them collapse as a fighting force. In 1864, the city of Tianjin, where Hong was residing, was surrounded and captured, followed by a massacre that killed over 100,000. Hong's fate is unclear, with some saying that he committed suicide and others saying that he died after mistaking a poisonous berry for manna from heaven, as he called it. After 14 years, the rebellion was finally over, but not after it had claimed the lives of over 20 million people. To put that into perspective, it's about 30 times the number of lives lost in the American Civil War, which occurred at around the same time. You know, Chinese civil wars have been historically some of the deadliest in history. In fact, I had originally decided to include some of them on the main list as well, but if I did, over half the entries here would be from the same country. So I decided to instead list some honourable mentions. Let's begin with the War of the Three Kingdoms in the 3rd century AD, which killed around 4 million, making it the deadliest war in ancient history. Later in the 8th century, the Yan-Lushan rebellion killed roughly 13 million, making it the deadliest conflict in human history up to that point. 6 centuries later, the fall of the Yuan dynasty killed about a third of all Chinese thanks to a little help from the bubonic plague. Afterwards, the collapse of the Ming dynasty and invasion by the Manchus in the 17th century killed around 25 million, 100 times more than the English Civil War, which occurred at around the same time. Ironically, the Chinese Civil War of the 20th century killed the least out of any of these conflicts. That being said, it was followed by the rule of Mao, which extinguished up to 40 million in famines and purges, making him the deadliest dictator in human history. So, tell me what you think. Do you like the list? Are there any ones that you would include that you think I have missed? If so, leave it in the comment section below whilst making sure to subscribe. This has been Basil Draffin. Have a nice day.